Hi Data Skibuli, this is Mix Martin with the summary video for lessons 1 through 3. I haven't included most of the YouTube video clips because I want this summary to be as concise as possible. This is lesson 1. It's about cell theory and atypical cells, and our guiding question is, what is the structure of a typical cell? And we'll see some exceptions to that typical structure. The first section is cell theory. Cell theory was developed by many scientists over many decades, but it has 3 principles. And those principles are: all living organisms are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living organisms. And all cells come from other cells. So all living organisms are made of cells. That means just what it says. Organisms can be unicellular or multicellular. So we have 2 unicellular organisms on the left. We have an amoeba that's about to engulf another unicellular organism. And of course, babies, like all humans, are multicellular, made of many cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living organisms. So when you look at the smallest unit of an organism that does the function of the organism, that's going to be a cell. So cells are organized into tissues, tissues are organized into organs, organs are organized into organ systems, and organ systems together make up a living organism. But the basic unit at the bottom is the cell. All cells come from other cells. So the picture on the left is an embryo dividing from a single-celled fertilized sperm and egg, single-cell embryo, and now it's reached the stage where it has 4. The video is of bacteria dividing. Bacteria are single-celled organisms, but when they grow, they can multiply their DNA, they can duplicate their DNA, and then they divide in half, and that's how we get more bacteria. But the embryo came from a sperm cell and an egg cell, and those bacteria came from other bacteria that grew, replicated their DNA, and divided. Let's talk about some features of typical cells. So one is their size. Typical eukaryotic cells, meaning cells that have a nucleus, those are 10 to 100 micrometers long. And 1 micrometer, or 1 micron, is a 10,000th of a centimeter, or it's a 1,000th of a millimeter. There's 1,000 micrometers in a millimeter. There's 10,000 micrometers in a centimeter. So these cells are very, very, very small. Too small to see with the eye. Structures that cells have in common include cell membrane, nucleus, and cytoplasm. Again, if we're talking about eukaryotic cells. How many nuclei are in each cell? There'd be 1 nucleus in each cell if it's a typical cell. And then the role of the nucleus, as you know, is that it contains the DNA, which has instructions for making proteins. You are expected to know about 3 atypical cells. The IB syllabus calls this questioning cell theory, but the existence of these cells doesn't really undermine cell theory, but it does point out some ways that cells might be unusual. One example of an unusual cell is found in your body, and these are the cells that make up your striated or skeletal muscle. That means the same thing. Skeletal muscle because it's connected to your bones, and that's how you move around. That's how you move your skeleton. Striated means striped, so this looks striped under the microscope. That's why it's called striated or skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells are unusual because they have multiple nuclei in one cell. So this fiber is part of one cell. It's not even the entire cell. And you can count many nuclei, which are these dark purple spots. So in this one, it looks like I can see 5 in this frame. In this one, quite a few more. So they're unusual in that they're very, very long. They're several centimeters in length. They're very, very thin. They're microscopically thin. And they have multiple nuclei in one cell. The thinness is not the unusual part. It's the length and also the multiple nuclei. Fungal hyphae, to tell you what these are, they're these filamentous structures that absorb nutrients in fungi. So if you see a mushroom above ground, there's a whole network of hyphae below the ground that are anchoring and nourishing that mushroom structure. There are different kinds of hyphae. So septate hyphae at the bottom here, they have septa or divisions between nuclei in the hyphae. So the septum of your nose divides your nose. The septum of your heart divides your heart. But the septa of septate hyphae, divided into distinct zones. So that's similar to multicellular organisms that we know. Some fungi have aseptate hyphae, so that means there are no septa, there are no divisions, and we just have this continuous cytoplasm with lots of nuclei. So instead of being divided into individual cells, it's just one continuous thing of cytoplasm. Another unusual cell is this giant algae. It grows up to 5 centimeters long as just a single cell. So the person is holding several of those. Sometimes they're called mermaids' goblets, which I like a lot. But these are kind of similar to the muscle fibers in that they're very big to be a single cell. If we discovered this organism and we didn't know about it, we would definitely assume it's multicellular based on its size. So now you know the 3 principles of cell theory, and you know 3 types of unusual cells. Lesson 2 is about the functions of life, and the guiding question is, what can all living organisms do? The mnemonic here is, you can imagine a guy, and he says, "Hi, my name is Mr. H. Gren." If you want to think of what the H stands for, you can name him yourself. Henry or Harold or whatever your favorite H name is. Mr. H. Gren can help us remember the 7 functions of life because, as you can see, it's a mnemonic. So metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, growth, response, excretion, and nutrition. Those are the 7 functions of life. So anything that's alive can do all 7 of these functions. Actually, let me clarify. So these are characteristics of a species rather than individuals. So if an individual person can't or doesn't reproduce, for example, that doesn't mean that they're not alive, but because the human species is capable of reproduction, every individual human is alive, regardless of whether they can reproduce or choose to reproduce. Metabolism is all the chemical reactions that occur within an organism, and we learned that this includes anabolism, building things up, and catabolism, breaking things down. Some reactions you've learned are DNA replication, protein synthesis, cell respiration, photosynthesis. All of those reactions together are the cell's metabolism, or the living organism's metabolism. Reproduction is producing offspring. That can be sexual or asexual reproduction. So here we have an organism that's simply dividing in 2. Those 2 offspring will be clones. Sexual reproduction results in offspring that are not genetically identical to the parent. Homeostasis, I want to explain a little bit more. So it's maintaining conditions inside the organism within tolerable limits. So the illustration here is giving us a good example. Your body temperature needs to be between specific limits. So if your body gets too cold, you can get hypothermia, and eventually you die. If your body's too hot, that's hyperthermia, and eventually you can die from that too. So you have to keep your body temperature between those extremes. There's a narrow range of survivable body temperatures. So your body has some responses to keep your temperature within that range. One response is shivering. So when you shiver, the contraction of your muscles generates heat to warm you up. And when you're too hot, your body sweats. And when we learned about water that water has a high heat of vaporization. So as your sweat evaporates, it carries heat away from your skin. So that's how sweating cools you down. Another example of a variable under homeostatic control is your water balance. So you can't get too dehydrated. That can kill you. Dehydration can kill you. But overhydration can kill you too. It makes your brain swell up, and that can put pressure on the brainstem and kill you. So you have to keep your internal water level between those limits, the limit of overhydration and the limit of dehydration. And so your body makes you feel thirsty when the water level in your inside of you drops, and then you drink water. Your kidneys are also regulating the water inside you. So I'm sure you've noticed if you're dehydrated, your pee can be pretty dark yellow, maybe almost brown, kind of stinky. So that's not a lot of water that's being lost in your pee. But if you're well hydrated, your pee is going to be very light yellow or maybe even clear, because your kidneys are letting a lot of water go, because you have plenty to spare. So your kidneys can regulate how much water is in your urine, along with the waste product called urea. Growth, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. Living organisms increase in size. When I say irreversible increase in size, I mean it's not something like a pufferfish swallowing a bunch of water and then spitting it out. It's like a baby growing to be a toddler, growing to be a child, or this plant in the image growing from a seed to a larger plant. Response is the ability to react to changes in the environment. So these responses can be automatic. The first picture is showing a plant bending towards the light. That's something they do automatically. They can be a reflex, like when you touch a hot pan, you're going to let it go without even thinking about it. And they can also be deliberate responses, so responses that the organism chooses to do. But in some way, all organisms can react to changes in the environment. Excretion is the removal of the waste products of metabolism. And this is the one where the greatest number of Discipuli get confused. Excretion doesn't mean pooping. Excretion means removal of the waste products of metabolism. So these are chemical byproducts of metabolic reactions. One of the reactions that you learned about is cell respiration. And the waste product of cell respiration is carbon dioxide. So when you breathe out, you are removing that carbon dioxide from your body. Breathing out is excretion. Another example is when you sweat, you also carry away some waste products. Another example is, again, your kidneys. So your kidneys filter out urea, which is a waste product of protein breakdown, and they put it into your pee, which goes into your bladder, and then you put it in the toilet. So the urea is the waste molecule that's being removed. So in all of these cases, we are talking about molecules. We're not talking about bulk. Excretion and egestion are not the same thing. Egestion is pooping. So excretion removes molecules that are the waste products of chemical reactions. Excretion happens in all organisms. You can also remember that excretion is not pooping because not all organisms poop, right? So plants are alive. I don't think we would argue about that. But I've never seen a plant waiting in line for a public bathroom. Plants don't poop, but they do excrete. So for them, the waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen, and that just diffuses out of their leaves and goes into the air around the plant. Egestion is the elimination of undigested food and happens only in animals. So if you think about it, the components of your poop never really were incorporated into your body tissue. They went into your mouth, they went into your stomach, they went through your intestines, and then they went out of you. So they never became really part of you as an organism. They just went through the tube that your body tissues surround. So please remember, excretion is not the same as pooping, and we can remember that because these are characteristics of all living things. So if plants don't poop, excretion can't mean poo-poo. Nutrition, pretty self-explanatory. Obtaining or producing nutrients to provide energy and the materials needed for growth. If you are a heterotroph, that means you have to consume you need to consume things for energy. So consuming other organisms, or the pizza, like these people here, has products made by organisms. The cheese, tomatoes are organisms. The flour that made the pizza dough, that's wheat, obviously. So the humans are consuming other organisms, even though that looks like vegetarian pizza. Plants can make their own nutrients in the process of photosynthesis, and that's something that we've learned about already. So you need nutrients to perform cell respiration to get ATP so that the cells of your body can have energy in the form that they can use, which is ATP. So for you get those nutrients by eating. You get the glucose that you need for photosynthesis by eating. You get the glucose that you need for cell respiration by eating. For plants, they get the glucose that they need for cell respiration through photosynthesis. All right, lesson 3, functions of life in unicellular organisms. So we learned in the previous lesson that cells can be multicellular or unicellular. And this is about how does that work? So if you're only one cell, how can you perform these 7 functions of life? The specific unicellular organisms that we're going to focus on are Paramecium and Chlamydomonas. The IB syllabus requires Paramecium and then an additional single-celled organism that can do photosynthesis. So this is kind of an old term, but these are animal-like and plant-like single-celled organisms. Paramecium is a group of unicellular freshwater organisms covered with hair-like cilia. So these little bristly things, that's a defining characteristic of the group that Paramecium belong to. And Chlamydomonas, it's a group of unicellular algae. It's found in stagnant water and damp soil. First, the Paramecium. The functions of the Paramecium. Let's start with this structure here. So this is the oral groove. And the cilia have the function of beating and causing currents of water where the Paramecium lives. It's almost like a crew team rowing with their oars. That's similar to what the cilia do. So the cilia sweep food particles, which are mostly bacteria, through the oral groove into this food vacuole, which is developing. The food vacuole is not a permanent structure. When it's full, that membrane is actually going to bud off, and a new food vacuole will be formed. This is a food vacuole where the food has been broken down by enzymes, and we can see other food vacuoles here. When the bacteria or other food particles are fully broken down, the food vacuole will fuse with this thing called the anal pore, which is a little bit of a gap between the cilia, and the undigested material can be expelled. These organisms have a macronucleus and a micronucleus. I'm not really going to get into the difference there, but that's where their DNA is contained. So they have the genetic information to make copies of themselves so that they can divide. They have contractile vacuoles, which are constantly bailing out the cell, so to speak. So the cell is taking on water because it's in a freshwater system. So water has the tendency to enter through the cell membrane of this organism. So the contractile vacuoles are always pushing out excess water to maintain homeostasis. let's look at some paramecia under the microscope. So you can see movement inside the cell. Those might be food vacuoles moving around. The winking that you just saw, there it is again, that's the contraction of the contractile vacuole. And there it is slowed down. So that's squeezing excess water out of the cell. This is becoming two paramecia, so there's a single one that just swam by. This paramecium is in the process of splitting into two. So when the process is over, the one will have become two separate individuals. That's, of course, the function of life of reproduction. This is showing the same thing. Once that membrane pinches off, there'll be two organisms. In this video, we can see the paramecia responding to stimulus in the environment. They're feeding on whatever the researcher put for them on the microscope side. When they bump into that place that has their food, they back up. So we can see the movement of the cilia taking food into the food vacuole. It's harder to see. Maybe I'll go back a little bit. Alright, so here we have them responding to the stimulus by bumping into and backing up. Here's the food vacuole. Here's the food vacuole. That's the oral groove. Oral groove and food vacuole. So you can see the streaming of the water, and that's because the cilia are beating to stream that water with the food source into the new food vacuole. And there was a contractile vacuole over there. You might have noticed the contractile vacuole contracting. You can see the oral groove and the new food vacuole. There's the contractile vacuole again. Remember, its role is to maintain homeostasis. Showing response again. Alright. The next organism is called Chlamydomonas. And the most important thing to notice is that it has this big chloroplast, which allows it to perform photosynthesis. So it doesn't have an oral groove like paramecium has, because it doesn't need one, because it can make its own nutrients. Another thing to notice is that it has an eye spot, which allows it to sense light. Its response to light is to move towards the light. Because it's photosynthetic, it needs light to perform photosynthesis. The flagella are these whip-like structures that allow it to move. So when they beat like a whip, they send the organism in the opposite direction. It has a nucleus with its DNA, so it has instructions for making protein, and a mitochondrion to perform cell respiration. Depending on the depth of focus, we can sometimes see the eye spot and sometimes see the flagella, but not always. Oh, I see the red eye spot on this one. The eye spot is red, so look for that. There's a flagellum there. That's in focus just now. There's an eye spot. So those are the things that we can notice. Oh, I see a flagellum. About these organisms under the microscope. You are going to finish this lesson with this organizational table. There's a video in the slides to support you in filling it out, and there's also a reading that's attached on Classroom. So this is how you will know that your notes are complete for this lesson. That is it for lessons 1 through 3. Thank you for watching.